Good evening, everyone. My name is John, and I'm the event coordinator here at Montreal Booksellers. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are delighted to have you all out here on this balmy Winnipeg evening to celebrate Montreal Standard Time, the early journalism of Mavis Gallant. We are joined by a wonderful cast of characters here to celebrate the publication of this book. So you'll be hearing this evening from co-editors Bill Richardson and Neil Besner. Your host for the evening will be the one and only Catherine Hunter. And we are also joined by Mariam Bernstein, the Winnipeg actor who will be performing a dramatic reading of some of Gallant's writing. So we do have quite a few treats in store for you. We're very grateful to the publisher, of course, Véhicule Press, for publishing this book in the first place and for making this evening a possibility. Introduced by Neil Besner, annotated by Bill Richardson, with an afterword by Marta Dvor, this new collection opens a window onto Gallant's fictional practice and perspective. And we're so pleased to have you all here tonight to hear a little bit more about that. To let you know procedurally how the evening will flow, there will be an intro and a reading from this podium. Then there will be a conversation that will take place at the velvet seats to my left. Following that, there will be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions, so please do let those percolate over the course of the evening. If you do have a question, please just raise your hand and I will rush over to you with this handheld microphone, which is not a comment on your ability to project, but does just ensure that those folks watching at home can hear your question. And if you are one of those people watching at home, hello, please just feel free to write any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll put them to our panelists as time permits. Now, I have the great pleasure of introducing your host. Catherine Hunter is a Winnipeg poet and novelist. Thanks to her mother, Catherine fell in love with the short stories of Mavis Gallant when she was a teenager, and has ever since been seeking to learn more about her. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Hunter.
Thank you, John. I didn't know he knew my mom, but. So I just want to start off the evening by saying we're very, very fortunate to have an accomplished actor here, Mariam Bernstein, who's going to perform an excerpt or so from Mavis Gallant's writing this evening. Mariam Bernstein has been working as a professional actor, director, and theater instructor for over 35 years. A graduate of the University of Winnipeg and the National Theatre of Canada, she has performed on stages across Canada. Among her favorite performing credits are Angels in America, Sweeney Todd, and the premiere of Selkirk Avenue. As a director of both musical and non-musical theater, her credits include Death of a Salesman, Romeo and Juliet, and most recently, Tuesdays with Maury. She has mentored teen and adult artists as an acting coach and instructor at the U of W, the U of M opera program, the Manitoba Theatre for Young People, and Prairie Theatre Exchange. And thank you, Mariam, for participating in this launch today. We're very glad to have you here.
Thank you. A wonderful country. I called him the Hungarian because I couldn't pronounce his name. If he had a name for me, I never heard it. We weren't what you'd call chummy. It was early in the war then, when there were still houses to rent and apartment hunters who could afford to be choosy. I was a junior assistant in a real estate office, making next to nothing and chasing every cent. That was how we met. If it had been any other way, we might have become friends because we were both so lonely in Montreal. But as it was, he needed a furnished house and I needed a commission. So I never bothered to ask if he liked Canada or anything else. I just waved street maps and leases and talked fast. He didn't know very much about this side of the world, and I was too busy to help him. He lived alone in a hotel, waiting for his family, and seldom going even to the Hungarian club. All he could say was, yes, or please, or no, 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 all of which meant, I don't understand. It was hot that summer. I rang sticky doorbells and talked to cross, perspiring people all over the city, trying to find the Hungarian a house. It had to be furnished. It had to have a yard and a nice room for his little girl. I'd like to see him try and find that these days. Even then, with places available, it wasn't easy. Then, a phone call came in one afternoon with something that sounded just about right. I didn't put it on the office list. I just picked him up at his hotel and started explaining in a taxi. It's suburban, I said, trying to make it sound all right. A little far, a little quiet, not too original, but good for the children. I wouldn't want it for myself, I said impetuously, and then stopped at once. You'll like it, I said firmly. And besides, they're leaving all the linen and dishes for you. Yes, he said. As I said before, we had very few conversations. Talking to him was like being lost in the bush. You could either sit down and give up or just keep stumbling ahead, hoping to come to something familiar. Linen, I repeated. Towels, blankets, sheets, pillowcases, bath mats, tablecloths, glasses, cups, soup plates. Please, he said. I gave up. The taxi stopped in front of a small brick duplex on one of those semi-suburban streets. There was a small lawn, yellow from the August sun, and a bicycle leaning against the porch. All the shades were down, as though the tenants had left for the summer. The street was still and flat, edged with telephone poles. I turned quickly and said, after all, it's the inside that matters. But he was smiling and bending his smooth gray head toward the window. So, he said with certain finality and marched up the cement walk. The couple who answered the door were alike as two pink junkets. The woman looked a bit sharper, as I remember her now, and rather sick. Her husband, whom she called Frank, was taller, but with the same pale eyes and thin, fair hair. They didn't look at each other. Sometimes by accident, their glances crossed, and it was like two express trains passing at full speed. She did all the talking. Once in a while, she would turn to him with a quick, "Isn't that right, Frank?" then pick up the conversation again before he could answer. She had made duplicate lists of every item in the house, she told us, and wanted them all checked. My Hungarian went on smiling and sometimes made small chirping sounds under the current of her words. Frank looked bored and sleepy. I just stared at the brown wallpaper and wondered if she wore hairnets to bed and Hoover aprons in the morning. It was all beyond me. I couldn't imagine why she was moving out or why he was moving in. I didn't know any of them. I suppose you want to look the place over, she finally offered. No, said the Hungarian. No. Come on, I said impatiently. He'll stand there all day saying that. He doesn't know what you're talking about. Just show him the living room. The woman looked a little amused and turned her shrewd, small face to a curtained arch. In there, she said. We moved past her and plunged at once into a lifeless room, so like a convent that I expected to hear a bell or see a plaster saint in one corner. You could smell wax and lemon oil, and sense a faint layer of dust. But you couldn't see very much because the air was dark green from years of being strained through the window shades. It was ugly. I remember, out of that clutter of plush and seashells, only one beautiful object made of tortoise shell, like a piece of fair freckled skin. The woman circled the room, droning the items from her list and touching each thing as she mentioned it. One large radio, she read, one radio lamp, one lace cover on radio, one small mat under radio, one squirrel on swing. She hadn't gone mad. The squirrel was 2 inches high and made of felt. He'd probably come from a sale at the IODE. He was on the radio, and as far as she was concerned, he was going to stay there, no matter who took over the house. That was the astounding part of it. Not only had she taken the trouble to collect the room's ugly contents, but she had confirmed their existence by writing them in a list, one under the other. Now she was double-checking their identity by taking us on a tour and pointing out each plaque and each doily as though it were a museum piece. The Hungarian looked a little puzzled, but his smile was amiable as ever. I wished for the first time that I'd made more of an effort to know him. The 4 of us were so disorganized in that room, it would have been nice to have felt some unity. The dining room took less time to examine. The woman ticked off the furniture quickly and was starting in on the china cabinet when I cut in with, let's look at the kitchen. I felt I couldn't bear 20 minutes of one china girl holding vinegar bottle, one small mustard pot marked Brantford, Ontario. There ought to be a law against people who paint their kitchens buff and have strange gray claws hanging from the pipes under the sink. It isn't that their kitchens aren't clean, it's just that all you can imagine coming from them are puddings and cold cuts. But the kitchen was the last room in the house, so I smiled reassuringly at the Hungarian. He was watching the woman as she opened a drawer in the table and emptied it onto the enamel top. One paring knife, she began. One egg beater. The Hungarian picked up the egg beater. He twirled the handle. What? He announced. Egg, I said. You beat them like this. Frank looked a bit indignant, but his wife actually broke an egg into the bowl and showed how it was done. The Hungarian loved it. He was particularly enchanted with the little top which fit around the beater so it wouldn't splash. He beat the egg into a great lemon froth. Then, lovingly and reluctantly, he put the bowl down. Madam, he said, what a wonderful country. It was the longest English sentence I had ever heard him speak. His cadence was that of a child singing something like bees are there, birds are there, butterflies in the air. The woman stopped reading from her list and just watched him. His enthusiasm was wonderful. He explained over everything: the string bean cutter, the cherry pitter, the bread knife with the measuring gadget, even the dish strainer. I couldn't believe he had never seen these things before. I thought he had come to life in this room because, bleak as it was the only living part of the home. It was here that you could sense the thousands of oranges cut for breakfast, the hundreds of tea dish towels put to soak, the stacks of empty cereal boxes, the rubbers and overshoes draining by the back door, the toast crumbs, the coffee grounds, the potato peels, the shreds of pie crust. Nowhere else was there debris of living. or any explanation for the couple's years together. But I was wrong. When the Hungarian spent 10 minutes playing with the automatic foot pedal on the garbage, I knew it was all genuine. For the first time, I saw the couple exchange a direct look. They thought he was foreign and ridiculous, and it was in his strangeness that they could find something in common. He's worth 10 of them, I thought, though I scarcely knew him better. It was just that it annoyed me to see them standing in the doorway together, looking smug and secure. Let's look at the linen, I said, and leave him here. He's perfectly happy. The woman looked at her husband once more and led the way to a cupboard in the hall. You'll find it all here, I think, she said vaguely, then turned and said, so low that I could hardly hear her, I'm going into the hospital and my husband's taking a furnished room. My little girl has gone to Toronto to stay with my mother. 50-50 chance. It was a moment or two before I realized what she meant. 50-50, I said stupidly, and then realized she meant her chances in the hospital. I said something idiotic like, oh, you'll be all right. But she was back counting the linen again. I wanted to shake her. It was like my neighbor whose son was killed at sea saying, I suppose you heard about the laddie. Then rushing on to some inanity about gas rationing. If you feel awful, I wondered, why don't you scream and cry? But there was no point in saying it. When we went back to the kitchen, I tried to let the Hungarian know that the people weren't bad, that they were in as much of a spot as he was. But I knew this was no time to start explaining them to him or him to them. The interplay was all their own, and I'd better leave them to it. We turned down the hall together, and the woman held the front door open for us. I couldn't look at her. Just as we were starting down the steps, he turned suddenly and caught her hand. Madam, he said earnestly, believe me, a wonderful country. Well, she said without expression, I guess you could call it that. We didn't hear the door slam until we were halfway down the walk. He was still chattering to himself about the wonderful country. I've often wondered how long the egg beater kept him happy. Thank you.
That is great writing and beautiful performance. I loved it, totally loved it. Yeah, it's great. Actually, I kind of have it's great writing it without my personal opinion, but I actually love writing about things, like objects, and often have to stop myself from doing it. That's enough description now. Okay, how's my mic, John? Am I okay here? Okay. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce these two gentlemen to my left. And on my near left here is Bill Richardson, which is wonderful to have him here in town. And Bill Richardson is a longtime fan of Mavis Gallant. Concerned that nothing seemed to be planned for the centennial of her birth in 2022, Bill began writing about her on Substack and also organized a few public events. And if you can find those on Substack, they're still up, right? Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed those. And then he's always mentioning like some story or article or something that, oh, I haven't read that one. And then luckily I have the access to the New Yorker archives, and I was able to find almost everything there. And so it was like almost like taking a mini course. I say mini because I didn't read it all, but so anyway, sorry. So doing these events and such brought him in touch with Neil Besner and Marta Dvor. Both, he calls them black belt academics, I love that. Both of them had written and published about Mavis Gallant. He interviewed each of them, and as they stayed in touch, they decided collectively to address the gap in publication that's represented by the absence of Gallant's early journalism in an accessible form. So that's what this book addresses, right? Allowing people to actually read her early journalism. And she wrote in Montreal. Hence the book. So Bill was born in Winnipeg on, is that true, Mavis Gallant's birthday?
Yes.
He was born in Winnipeg on Mavis Gallant's birthday. And Marta, I think you told me, is also has the same birthday.
August 11th.
Yeah, just in case you want to send greetings, yes, August 11th. And okay, and he continues to live part-time in Manitoba. He has a house in Crystal City. In 1978, he moved to Vancouver to attend UBC, and says he stayed there, quote, more or less by accident, because they didn't have the imagination to go somewhere else, end quote, which is not true because he has an amazing imagination, as we know. He worked as a librarian and then at CBC in one guise or another for 30 years, mostly in radio. And I'm sure that many of you will remember his radio broadcasts, or was delightful. He did Richardson's Roundup and Saturday Afternoon at the Opera. And in my house, that often left us breathless from laughter. Bill is also a very excellent writer. He still writes about Mavis Gallant, though not as regularly as in the months that were leading up to her 100th birthday. At that time, it was a daily event. He has published what he calls a kind of commonplace book. Is this online?
It's on Substack.
It's on Substack. Okay. On Substack, called The Bankhead Gleaner, where he shares odd things he finds while reading. With his partner, Bill Peckett. Bill Peckett is the artist who designed Emptyful, which is the light water installation we know at Millennium Library. And so Bill Peckett and Bill Richardson worked together to publish occasional children's books, mostly with Running the Goat books out of Torres Cove, Newfoundland. And most recently, My Bunny Lies Over the Ocean, which is a sing-along book. Gotta get that. Bill also produced a wall calendar for 2025 using images pirated from realtor websites. It's called Tea Towels Hanging in Canadian Kitchens. So I think the Hungarian would have really liked that book, or that calendar. And I just want to add that Bill is the author of numerous other books, including The Bachelor Brothers Bed and Breakfast, Waiting for Gertrude, A Graveyard Gothic, and many others. And my personal favorite, I Saw Three Ships, West End Stories, and stories from the West End of Vancouver, a really fantastic book. So he's going to be part of the conversation, and he was one of the editors of this book.
Yep.
And another editor of this book, also going to be part of the conversation, is the gentleman to my far left, Neil Besner. Now, Neil Besner taught Canadian literature and other subjects, such as the short story, American fiction and poetry, and fiction and translation at the University of Winnipeg from 1980. It's UW night, I think, here. All of us have connections to UW. Anyway, sorry. He taught at the U of W from 1987 until his retirement in 2017. He writes mainly on Canadian authors, on the short story, and on the poet Elizabeth Bishop, with books on Mavis Gallant, Alice Munro, an edited collection on Carol Shields, and numerous articles, book chapters, and reviews, as well as co-edited books on the short story and on poetry. His prize-winning translation from Portuguese of a Brazilian biography of Elizabeth Bishop in 2002 was the major source for the 2013 Brazilian feature film, Reaching for the Moon. From 2004 to 2020, Neil was the general editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, published by Laurier Press, University Press? Laurier University Press? Sorry, I should know that. And it's a book of contemporary Canadian poetry. Oh, here it is, Wilfrid Laurier University Press, sorry. And they have published, with Neil at the helm, Neil was the originator of it, over 30 volumes to date. So that is a huge service to Canadian poetry. Thank you, sir. His most recent books are the memoir, Fishing with Chardelli, and this co-edited work with Bill Richardson and Marta Dvor, Montreal Standard Time, Mavis Gallant's Early Journalism. And forthcoming from the Louisiana State University Press in 2026 is Neil's translation from Portuguese into English of a study of Elizabeth Bishop's work in Brazil. At the University of Winnipeg, Neil served in several senior administrative roles. His last post was as provost and vice president academic from 2012 to 2017. And throughout all of this work, Neil has remained very active in the Winnipeg writing community, doing editing at Turnstone Press, serving on boards and contributing his talents to our organizations, such as the Manitoba Writers Guild and the International Writers Festival, now called Plume, and facilitating and hosting just too many literary events to count. So great contribution. So we have two very distinguished creative people here. And the conversation started.
I just want to add something about Catherine Hunter, the person who just emceed. Catherine was the editor of the very first volume of the LPS, the Laurier Poetry Series. Now it's on. I can hear myself. She edited the only volume to sell out in the entire series. It was the poetry of Lorna Crozier. And the reason I asked Catherine to edit it as the first book was because I knew A, that she would do a fantastic job, which she did, and B, that she wrote the kind of prose that was accessible to everyone, straight ahead, clear, concise, taught, T-A-U-T. She was just a wonderful exemplar for everybody who followed. So let's have a hand for Catherine Hunter.
Can I say one thing as well, just to speak to someone who's not with us tonight, who I know would have loved to have been here, and that's Marta Dvor, who worked with Neil and with me on putting together this collection. And Marta has a big Winnipeg connection, and that I hope I'm not misspeaking here. Neil, correct me if I do. I believe Marta's family came from Hungary after 1956, and both her parents were musicians. She is in fact kin to the composer, to Dvorak. And her father was, I believe, a trombonist, and her mother was a really outstanding violinist. She was another Marta, her name is Marta Heedy. And they lived in Winnipeg for a few years, and then Marta Dvorak's mother, Marta Heedy, was invited to go to Hamilton to set up the music department at McMaster, and so that's where Marta completed her growing up. But she's a wonderful scholar and a wonderful writer, and I'm sorry that she lives in Paris and was a friend of Mavis's. I'm sorry she can't be with us tonight, but she has a very clear and deep connection to the city. So we're thinking of you, Marta.
That is all true, and thank you, Bill, for saying that, because she had the most intimate connection with Mavis of the three of us.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
She was a friend of hers when Mavis was ill in her later years. Marta read to her, frequently visited her, and was a true friend to her. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, they called themselves birthday twins because they were both born on, again, this is my birthday. So we all share the August 11th birthday, but that meant something to Mavis when she and Marta met. She settled on that as one of the kind of linchpins of a future friendship. She was impressed by the fact that they shared this birthday. Joe Rogan does too.
We just thought you'd like to know that.
Thanks, Bill. I was gonna ask you about Marta.
Well, just
'Cause I
cross that
remember.
question off your list.
So, yeah,
No, we should talk about her. So she wrote the book, Mavis Gallant, The Eye and the Ear
Yeah.
in 2019. How do I know? Because I reviewed it. I mean, it's an excellent book, but she's been organizing Mavis Gallant conferences for years and years, and has been a kind of guiding light.
Yes.
I have to say, and I miss her here, and I think she might be watching on YouTube, and if she is, hello, Marta, we miss you.
thanks. So, can I ask a little bit about the genesis of this project?
You can ask.
You know, and how did it sort of get started? Was it collective, all three of you came up with it together in a conversation, or?
Well, yeah, as you said, Catherine, introducing this, in 2022, I was aware that this was going to be that was going to be the centennial year of Mavis Gallant's birth. She died in 2014. And that was in February, I think it was February 13th of 2014 that she died. And I kept on thinking, well, is there a shortage of bunting happening because of all the parades that are planned? Is her face going to be on a stamp? The answer to all these things was no. And so I thought that I would do my own small bit to do something about Mavis Gallant, only because I loved her writing for so many years. I can't remember when I first read her, but I remember vividly that when the collection called From the 15th District came out, which would have been about 1978, I think. That was when I thought, oh wow, this is really astonishing. Anyway, so at that time, I had a job working in a grocery store, and I had a 4 a.m. start, and I decided that I would get up as early as I could, which is about 2 a.m., and write every day about Mavis Gallant, and write from the position of not somebody who was an academic, but just somebody who was a fan, and to write it as a kind of diary. And part of my decision to write it as a diary, where I talked about my own life and my connection to her and about all kinds of things, was that the other thing that was of interest to me at this time was that her, in 2012, it had been announced that her diaries, she was a devoted diarist, her diaries from the 1950s and the 1960s were going to be published. They were being published by Bloomsbury in the UK, by Knopf in the States, and by McClellan and Stewart in Canada. I was excited by this. I can't wait to read those. And they were meant to come out in 2014. And this was announced. There's a piece in the New Yorker about it, which is where she published her short stories, as you probably know. And there's a piece in the New York Times, and so that great. And I looked forward to it with some alacrity. And 2014 came and went, and there were no diaries. And from time to occasional time, I would check bibliographic sources to find out where they were in the works, and there just seemed to be no sign of them. And so I became interested in that, to find out what the story of the diaries was, and that was part of why I wrote my famous diary. Anyway, as part of all of this is way more information I need. I'm certainly begging, I'm going to stop now. As part of my Substack work, I interviewed Neil and I interviewed Marta, and after that we stayed in touch. And we were all interested in this early journalism. Neil had written about Mavis for his PhD dissertation, and then in a book published subsequently, and he had access to all of this material. And so we just decided that we would start working with it, read through it, make some selections, and see if we could find a publisher. So that's really
Great. And you're supposed to be talking, that's what you're here for. So where were all these pieces of journalism? Like you got them from our library archives or?
No, so I started working on Gallant in 1980. And so there had been no PhD done on her, and there had been nobody looking at her journalism. So what I did was I was at UBC, and I went to interlibrary loan, and the interlibrary loan people at UBC were fantastic. And they tracked down for me the microfiche of Montreal Standard, and they sent it to UBC, and the women there were unbelievable. And I just haunted the microfiche reader for a year and a half. I photocopied everything. And so Bill will know this because I kept all of that material. I had to read all of the journalism. There were about 150 pieces of journalism and some pieces called On the Air, which was her radio stuff. And then there were movie reviews and occasional columns, and so there's a lot of material. So I photocopied it all. I assembled it in folders, and when we started talking about, and then of course when I wrote the thesis, I drew on that journalism. Am I allowed to tell one anecdote? I think I'll just very quickly.
You have to.
Okay, yeah, very quickly. So what happened was Gallant came to UBC. The first time I met her was in 1981. Home Truths had just come out. It won the Governor General's Award for the wrong book. It's okay. It was Selected Canadian Stories. Wrong way to think about her writing. Her best book is from the 15th District. Bill is right about that. But anyway, at that point, she said to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, I was having lunch with her, and she could be very forbidding. She could appear to be very forbidding. She never was with me, but she had that rep. And so she said, "Write me a letter. Write me a letter about what you're doing." So I wrote her with my heart in my teeth, a 3-page typewritten letter about what exactly I was going to do. And it came back to me 4 weeks later with writing up and down the margins, both sides, and on the back of one of the pages said, "Please turn over." And I did. And one of the things, here's the relevance. I said in the letter that one of the things that I was going to suggest in the thesis was that I thought that there were intimate links between her journalism and her stories. And as one example, she had one piece called "Is Romance Killing Your Marriage?" which is hysterically funny but serious. And I said that I thought that that piece informed in substantial ways the title story of her first book called The Other Paris in 1957. She underlined that in the letter, and it said, in the margins, it said, "If you suggest any such thing, my response will be immediate and terrifying legal action." I thought, I was a kid, I was a PhD student. I took it to Bill New, my supervisor. I said, "Bill," he laughed, he said, "You're on your own." But the truth of it is, I went ahead and did that. And she read the book, and she wrote me a very nice letter about the book that said, "I liked what you said, this. Never said a word about the connections between journalism and fiction." And then later on, as Bill knows, in 1987, she gave a long talk in which she talked at length about her journalism and her fiction. And by that time, she was very forthright about how much writing for the Standard had taught her about writing and how she used that material in her short fiction. So that's why the anecdote is interesting. And so I maintained a kind of, I did not have the kind of friendship with her that Marta had, but I did have a good connection with her. She was never nasty with me. She was nasty with some other people who will remain unnamed. But she was always extremely helpful and generous and forthright. And one last anecdote on this thought. I was in Paris with her at a conference. Marta was there as well. And I was going to Germany the next day. and I had never been to Germany. This was in 2002. It was a conference that Marta had in fact organized. And I said to her, I said, Mavis, I'm nervous. I'm going to Germany for the first time. As you know, I'm Jewish. She looked at me and she said, why are you nervous? Don't you know that the seat of anti-Semitism in Europe is right here, Paris? I said, no, I did not know that. I'll stop.
Interesting. Yeah, so I haven't read too much of this yet, but I read two pieces. And the one is about the very last, about the habitual criminal. And I was just amazed by it. And what was the other one I read? Oh, about the artist, Roberts. So she writes so well. And these would have just been little pieces for this like throwaway a newspaper, right? And I wasn't too astonished because, you know, I had read a lot of her short stories, so I knew that how good she was, but that she could take something like that and turn it into like really a work of art.
Can I say something about your work, Bill? I'm just thinking, so Bill annotated every one of these pieces. The research that Bill did to write around each of these pieces was, and it is the substance of his Substack as well, is just astonishing. So he unearthed many, many things about, and believe me, Mavis Gallant says, most of my work is cutting. It's one of her remarks that I have admired for 50 years. Bill had to cut down his material to fit in this book, but what he unearthed about the pieces, the stories, she insisted in early in her career, these are pieces and the others are stories. Don't you, well, but what Bill unearthed is amazing about her life. There's a biography written about her as we speak, but also about the pieces. The context that Bill has provided for the pieces is astonishing. It's remarkable. Just have to say that. I know you're not listening, but there you go.
Well, that's kind of, thank you. I should say that the piece that Mariam read is aberrant in the book in that it is actually a piece of fiction. It is the only piece of fiction that is in the book. Plainly, it is a retelling of something that happened to her, and she said as much in that Margaret Lawrence lecture that Neil mentioned. That was a Margaret Lawrence lecture given for the Register of Montreal Canada in 1987. There's a collection, and if you're interested in that's really core source stuff for Mavis Gallant as a journalist. That and a short story, which is one of the Limit Year stories. Those are the ones that were collected in Senior's Moment.
Home Truth.
Home Truth, thank you. They're very much autobiographical stories called with a capital T. Those are the places to go to read about her time there. But so that piece was published actually in the Montreal Standard as a piece of fiction, not as one of the features which she more routinely wrote. But we should talk a little bit about the paper itself, because it was an amazing piece of work, the Montreal Standard. Shortly after, Mavis Gallant was hired there in June of 1944, and she went to Paris, I think it was October the 7th of 1950, and that was her time there, those 6 years. And she wrote an amazing amount of work. She was incredibly industrious. It's only a small portion of this is represented here. That's true with the book that was published in Canada in 96, 98 as selected stories. It was published in the States as collected stories, which is incorrect. I mean, it was a sizable selection of her stories. And there's one that's just coming out now called The Uncollected Stories. I think those two together will bring everything together. In any case, the Standard was a huge production, and every week there was a series of photo essays, the rotogravure. There were features. There was a lavish colored cartoon section, and it would run to routinely 110, 120, 130 pages every week. and it was distributed with I guess the Star in Montreal and then elsewhere across the country as well. And after she left, just a couple of weeks after she left, it's not a cause effect thing, but it became Weekend Magazine, which probably a lot of us remember. It was published around the same time as the Star Weekly, very similar kind of thing. And she continued to freelance for that. Those pieces aren't in this book either. Over the course of her first year in Paris, and they're really interesting to read those pieces. Because and you can find them more easily than these. But the volume of work and the variety of work, and I think that something that interested all of us as well was the fact that she's a very young woman. She was born in 1922, hired in 1944 in June. She was 21 years old when she was hired. And when you read the very first piece that she wrote, which is called Meet Johnny, it's about a street kid. It's all there, right? Everything that she wrote about as her career progressed is all there. The brilliance of the observation and the precision of the speech and the deft hand of metaphor. She just knew right away what she was doing, and to think about somebody being that young and in that city at that time. So she moved back to Montreal after having been at high school with Lauren Bacall, as she wrote about. Lauren Bacall was a classmate of hers at the Julia Richmond School for Girls in New York. Patricia Highsmith was there at the same time, oddly enough. They always harbored this. I don't think they knew each other, but it always thought that would have been a duo. Mavis Gallant and Patricia Highsmith in the same room. I mean, just can you imagine? Anyway, and there are some of her early short stories that are very Highsmithian. They're very experimental and very peculiar and completely wonderful. But to think of her, 21 years old, moving back to Montreal after this time and immersing herself in the city. It's a city at war. It's a city where the church is losing control, end of Duplessis years. Historically, a fantastic time in the city. And so much going on. And then in the post-war years, when she was there, everything that was happening across the country post-war with returning troops and the housing crisis and all of this she writes about. Immigration, industry, the arts, like Goodrich Roberts, as Catherine mentioned. And there's a quality of real excitement about that. Just there's the picture that's on the front of the book, which is her in her office at the Standard, sitting at her typewriter. The ashtray is full, you know. I imagine there's probably a bottle of whiskey in the desk, you know. I mean, it was, I just love so much the idea of her doing that and being so productive. One thing some of the best writing she did there was this column called On the Air, and they were radio reviews. She did it for about 18 months, I think. And they are just fantastic. She's rude and she's snarky and she's insightful and funny, and the instincts that are on display there are just fantastic. So yeah, it was a wonderful immersion in her work.
You just reminded me of two things. Number one, she never got an assignment. She went to the editors of the paper and said, I would like to write about this. I would like to write about that. She wasn't given assignments. She was the one who asked. And if you look at the range, there's 38 pieces here which cover a broad spectrum, but the range, of course, was much wider than that. So she got to choose what she wrote about, which is extraordinary. And don't forget, there weren't a lot of women in newsrooms at that time. And if you look at the Lynette Muir stories, you'll see how much she has to say about being a woman in place of men who are away at war or this or that, the other. In other words, that she's tolerated in the newsroom. And then one other thing. You're right, Bill. I mean, to be 21 years old and be able to write like that, I'm just reminded of something that Gallant said that she had heard and she believed. She said, talent lands like a bird on one's shoulder. That's what she said. She said you have to read voraciously and then spit out everything that you can't use. And she was a voracious reader, but it was about talent. And I agree with you. To be 21 years old and to write some of those things, amazing, incredible.
Well, and there was such an assembly of people at, well, in Montreal, generally speaking, but working at the Standard as well. People like, well, her good friend, she was Barbara Chipman, who was from here. I mean, there's again, there are some Gallant Winnipeg connections. The name Gallant is one of them. Her husband, John, or Johnny as he was usually called, Johnny Gallant, grew up in Winnipeg, and he was a very talented pianist. And you can find, if you scour through the newspaper archives, all kinds of references to him giving concerts and recitals as a student, and he was composing as well. And then he eventually moved to Toronto and then to Montreal, and became. He was sort of the musical maitre d' at the Ritz for many, many years. And it was a short-lived marriage, but she held on to the name. She didn't want to go back to being Mavis Young. I think she liked the sound of Mavis Gallant, and she also liked the Acadian connection because his family was from Prince Edward Island. And I believe his sister eventually moved back to PEI and ran a candy store there. I'm pretty sure that's what she did. But in any case, and Johnny lived in London for a long time, and then he eventually moved back to Winnipeg, and he's buried in the Elmwood Cemetery. Anybody feels? Let's all go afterwards. It's just the night for it. Say hi to Johnny. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted. Do you have a question?
Well, you guys are doing great. You guys are doing great.
Don't interrupt, Catherine.
I don't want to. I'm just interested in everything that you're saying. I didn't realize that Mavis Gallant spent her time in Paris after the war, and of course I should have been able to figure that out just from her birth date. But I remember reading her short stories and being kind of they're saturated with, I can't think of which ones now, or the titles, but the ones I was reading, they're just saturated with post-war,
Yes.
the horror of the war and what's all been going on, and yet it was subtle enough so that the majority of my classmates, when we were reading this in the Claudia Works class actually, didn't see any connection to the war and thought that I was kind of obsessed with that.
Oh.
And I am somewhat obsessed with the Second World War because my father was in
As
it, but
No, arguably, that's the whole project.
that's her whole thing.
Yeah, and when Neil said that she was able to essentially write her own ticket to the Standard and she was self-assigning, well, this is true. But there's a great interview that was published in Canadian fiction magazine by, help me out, Jeff.
Hancock.
Thank you, Jeff Hancock.
1978.
And I think it was the first long interview that was done with her in English, and it's really a great interview. But she tells this story about how, and this, well, she started in 1944, so it would have been, she hadn't been on the paper long. In addition to writing the features, she would organize these photo shoots for the Royal Gravure, for the photo essays that were the first part of the Standard, and so she would go out with photographers, and there were like really outstanding photographers who were working there as well, and she was very involved in essentially in the art direction of the piece, and then she would write the captions for them. So that was an important part of what she did, and that isn't that well represented in the book either. There could easily be 2 more books of this size with that material in it. But she was assigned when the pictures started coming in from concentration camps. And I remember seeing these for the first time, and how they were published like in Life magazines. I was born in 1955, so by the time I was seeing them, they were kind of well known, but of course they were new to me, and the horror of those photographs. But she was one of the first people to see them. There was nothing, and no one had any idea. And her assignment was to write the captions for these photographs. And she talks in this interview, it's incredibly moving, about how she took them home and she laid them out on the table, on her dining room table, and made the decision, an aesthetic decision, a writer's decision, that the writing had to be as stark as the photos. The photos didn't need anything to support them, that the writing couldn't be weighed down with adjectival or adverbial ballast. It had to be plain. So that's what she wrote. She turned it in, and when the supplement was published, it was a special supplement, and you can imagine the effect of it. They hadn't used her work, and she hadn't been told that. And she went to the editors and said, what's going on? And they just said something like, you're too easy on the Germans. You talk about German culture, and nobody who reads our paper is interested in culture or words to that effect. And she describes how she went home and she wrote in her journal, it is always going to be like this. I would give, she said that she burned those captions, and she burned a lot of stuff when she said she did, when she left Montreal for Paris, and including some novel manuscripts. And I would give anything to see them. I would give anything to see them. It's such an incredible story.
It's an instructive story, and it always interested me that they turned down her captions and how much that affected her, because, as you know, one whole book of stories, the so-called German stories, Pegnitz Junction, which was her favorite book, is about post-war Germany and everything that led up to. She said that she tried to find the worm in everyday living that led to this highly cultured country, Germany, doing those things. She could not find the structure in everyday life that satisfactorily explained. And then whenever I read those stories, I think about those captions and what she wrote. What was it that so offended the editors of the Montreal Standard that they cut them?
So was she like, just bare bones, like, here's the door that they're walking through? Like, just, is that how she did it? Do you know?
In that case, I have no idea how she would have, the captions for that she wrote for the rotogravure were descriptive. They always told, they told quite a different story. They would be published along with a shortish essay that lived independently, and what you read in here when we've used the rotogravure stories is that her shorter piece. And then the captions never repeated that. They were always very independent, and when you string them all together, they actually make their own quite interesting story. But just to say about this, the business of her being in Europe after the war, and again, Neil knows this and Mara knows this, it's been a bit of an obsession for me, and it was part of the reason that I wanted to write about her as well, is that Mavis Gallant was, she was not a Jew. I don't know if she actually had a faith with which she identified. I think she was buried. It was a Catholic service. I think she would have said that she was Anglican or Church of England or something. I think that's how she was raised, in as much as she was raised in a religion. But she came from a Jewish family. Her mother's family was Jewish. And it fascinates me that somebody who had so many Jewish friends and connections, who was so interested in the experience of refugees, never wrote specifically or personally about that. There is no, I don't think there, I've thought about it a lot, and I don't think there is an answer to why that is. But it's there. One can speculate, of course, but the idea that somebody would go to Europe and be so interested in Germany when she, of course, knew that even though she wasn't Jewish by Nuremberg law, she would have been Jewish enough had she been there. And it must have affected her. How could it not have?
Well, and it affects non-Jewish people also.
Of course, yeah.
I was just thinking of the way that these things would be just layered into the descriptions of the scenes, so that at one point, I don't know, somebody's in an apartment and I think, well, she was cleaning somebody else's dresser, and there is like, I forget what it was, but it was obviously Nazi symbol, like in the jewelry box, right?
Oh, I wonder if
In
you
this
were,
house.
I wonder, maybe you were reading Irina.
Irina, it was Irina.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and that story is one about, she felt very close to that story. And I'm sure she felt close to them all, but it's a Christmas story, that story. She wrote a lot of Christmas stories, or stories that you could call Christmas stories, but it's always very bleak. One of them is a great story called Virus X, and it has a Winnipeg connection as well. It's about two young women from Winnipeg who knew each other at high school but occupied different social circles, and they find themselves in Paris and then traveling around through France together. They go to visit the great Catherine Mansfield and that kind of, and one of them is loose, and the other one is not, and it's about this strange friendship, and it has quite a lot to do with Winnipeg. That story, Virus X, I recommend it heartily.
Oh, loose.
Pardon?
Loose? Okay. It took a while for me to.
Virus X. Virus X.
To interpret that
Oh,
word.
loose. Oh, sorry. Yes, loose.
So, yeah, so I think I think I was supposed to see, John, do we have time to take some questions or?
I'm afraid the conversation has been so intoxicating that instead people will be able to ask questions directly at the signing table. That way they're unmediated by me as well. So.
We're just getting started, John.
Yeah, it's 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
So, but just fascinating though. I'm so looking forward to reading this. It's gonna be great.
I feel I'm very undisciplined here tonight.
You guys were perfect. I was afraid like you weren't saying anything.
I've been
I forgot who
feeling-
you were, you know?
Have we thanked you? I don't think we've actually thank you so much for, it was a miserable, horrible night.
Yes,
And thank you outside.
exactly, and thank Nally Robinson too,
Yes.
as always, John. You have no idea how we restrained ourselves. You have no idea. So- That's the Reverend James Christie who just opined from the audience.
Well, I'm going to offer a touch more gratitude myself, but first I know you all have been desperately wondering what the procedural notes are for assigning. So I will say that in just a moment, we will relocate Neil and Bill over to this table here, and they will sign books for you. Please do feel free to have a copy of the book signed before you pay for it, but please do pay for the book. You'll be very grateful. And to continue the gratitude once again, thank you all for braving the streets of Winnipeg to be here with us tonight. Thank you so much to Marta Dvor in absentia, but here in our hearts as well. And also, of course, to Mariam Bernstein for her incredible reading at the beginning of the event. I'm now going to humbly request some uproarious applause for Bill Richardson, Catherine Hunter, and Neil Besner.